Hello, gentle listener, and welcome to the Moonflower Path podcast, where we talk all things cozy, seasonal, and somatic self-care. I'm your host, Carolyn, and your gentle companion along walking this path of being a moonflower. If it's your first time here, thank you so much for being here, for stopping by, and for listening to this conversation. Please consider becoming a subscriber and sharing the podcast with a friend who you think might appreciate a little extra support along their self-care journey. If it's not your first time here, welcome back. Lovely to spend some time with you. For the month of December, we are exploring the theme of coziness. If you didn't catch the first two episodes that came out this month, I would very much encourage you to listen to those. First one being titled Making Cozy a Way of Life, and the second one being titled Cozy Gaming as a Form of Self-Care with YouTuber Iona. When I was thinking about different conversations, different topics I wanted to explore this month, at the very top of the list was reading. I don't know if there's anything that's a whole lot cozier than curling under a warm blanket in your favorite chair in your living room and reading your favorite book. So today I bring to you a conversation with the author of one of my favorite reads from this past year, the Halfling Saga. There are currently 2 books out of this series, and a third one is coming out very soon. If you haven't read these books yet, you will quickly want to add them to your TBR after listening to this conversation with Melissa Blair. But I do know that some of you who are listening have read this book, and so I think it'll be really fun for you now to tune into this conversation. It's been a long time coming. I've been really excited to bring this conversation to you. Full transparency. In this conversation, we do absolutely talk about the book. We talk about the inspiration behind the book. We talk about some of the foundational themes in the book, but we also talk about what it's like to be a creative person and navigating the ups and downs that come along with that, and very specifically adding in the added layer of navigating depression. Melissa is super honest, very vulnerable, and really real in this conversation, and I felt truly honored for the things that she shared, and I personally got a lot out of this conversation, and I know that you will too. A little bit more about our guest before we get into this conversation. Melissa Blair, she, her, is an Anishinaabe from the northern part of Turtle Island, also known as Canada. She writes books that explore themes of colonialism, identity, cultural revitalization, and Indigenous sovereignty. When she's not writing, she's posting bookish content on her TikTok or failing to get through her massive TBR pile. Apart from books, Melissa loves board games, hiking, and movies, but absolutely despises spoons. Good to know. You can find more out about Melissa and her books by clicking the link in the show notes. But let's get into this conversation. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I very much hope that this offers you a worthy dose of coziness to your day. Welcome to the Moonflower Path podcast. This space is for the highly sensitive, the creatives, the earth-loving, the caregivers, the weirdos, the feelers, the change makers, and dreamers of the world. Here, we are all about guiding you to trust your body intuition so you can find home and shift culture. Through the exploration of somatic practice, self-care, and seasonal ritual, my hope is that you will be inspired to be in harmony with yourself and in a dance with the earth. I'm your host, Carolyn, and I'm so honored and grateful to be here with you today. Welcome, Melissa. Welcome to the podcast. I feel very honored because we were just talking before we hit record about how busy you are these days. So thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to come and chat with me.
Oh, no problem. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, good. So let's get right into it. Let's get real right off the bat. Kira, the main character of the books, is a real badass. Yes, she has her shit to work out, but she's strong the whole way through in so many different ways. You talk about how you are influenced by reading other stories with badass female protagonists. I'd love to hear more about who those influences are, maybe the ones in stories and also the ones in real life, and how that all weaved into creating this character.
Yeah, the inspiration behind Kira's archetype was it's a very, very commonplace archetype for a protagonist in the subgenre of fantasy romance. And this whole series was kind of like a thought experiment that happened after reading so much of it during the pandemic. That was the most popular genre by far on Book Talk, which is the bookish community on TikTok at the time. So I was reading so much of it for the first time, all the popular series, a whole bunch of indie series, and they all seem to have this really like strong badass female character who was good with some sort of weapon. Usually it was a sword, sometimes it was a bow and arrow, sometimes it was an axe. And I want to do my own take on that, that really like dove into the indigeneity of the character, but also the trauma that comes along with, being forced to oppress people, especially your own people. So that was the inspiration there. And I think like for actual, like where I got a lot of like Kira's character traits from, I think was mostly from reading indigenous fiction, not even fantasy, just like a lot of the indigenous fiction that are all over my bookshelves. Um, I remember reading a book, Birdie by Tracy Lindbergh, and it's about a Cree woman. And it was the first time that I had really read a book that other mental health things were happening, and there was this personal journey, and it wasn't fully resolved by the end of it. And I really, craved that in the fantasy romance space. Kira is an alcoholic. She has substance abuse issues, and it's very common in the subgenre to kind of just use that as like a mini character arc throughout a part of a book or one book, and then it kind of like just falls to the wayside. And I really wanted to get into the head of someone who, what would it be like to live in such a traumatizing fantasy world as this, and try to be as accurate in my portrayal as possible. So that's where Kira came from. She's a badass, but she's got a lot of stuff to heal through.
Yeah. Okay, that's really interesting. I like that point of saying I didn't want it to just be kind of like a small component or something that was like quickly wrapped up, and that was something that was like stretched out, because it is throughout the first two books that I've read that are out. Is it definitely is stretched out, which is much more realistic. Like it's when we're navigating all of those different types of things, it's something that stays with us for a long time because it's like deep, dark stuff. So
Yeah, I also don't
yeah.
think it's something that you're going to be able to fully heal from in the course of, trying to win a kingdom back, and people are dying constantly. And it's a super like her entire journey that we get to see is a very like fight or flight kind of response. I don't think that's the best place to fully settle all of that, for lack of a better word, trauma that she has. And that'll continue through all the way to the fourth book. I won't say anything else about that because I don't want to spoil my plans.
Must be so hard not to do that.
Oh, it's very hard. There's something coming up in the third book, and people are starting to read it now. And all I want to do is like, what'd you think about that part? And ask them, but they're not allowed to talk about it yet, so I can't.
Yeah, yeah. Oh my gosh. And also like as the author, you're having to like embody some of these things to be able to write them. And so you're so far forward in their journey compared to the readers. And so I can imagine that's like a challenging kind of thing to dance.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a challenge. The hardest part of it, I think, is not telling people. I also
Mhm.
like to surprise everyone who works on my books. So Like my editor is the only person who knows. My main editor, her assistant, no one else who works on the book, no one who beta reads for me knows what's coming, because I like to try and get an authentic of a reaction and feedback as I can. But I also love to talk about the things that I have planned. I'm terrible at keeping secrets. So that's the hardest part. The actual putting it together is really fun. Like there are things, even in A Broken Blade, that don't pay off until the last book. And it was so fun kind of weaving those in there. And I think there's been one person who has caught what I'm doing and didn't exactly get it right, but definitely knew, oh, this is just thrown in here for a reason. I think this means something. And that's really fun. Seeing the theory videos is so much fun.
So on to the next question. There are so many highlighted quotes and amazing lessons found in Kira's story. Like I read on my Kindle and there's like so many different things highlighted in the book. So it wasn't easy to choose one quote, but here's one that really spoke to me and what we really highlight here in the Moonflower Path. And this ties into the conversation we were just having about how dark stuff takes a little bit of time to navigate. And also it never really goes away. So this is from the second book, actually, I realized. I cried for her, that girl who had to overcome her fear of the dark all alone. I wished that I could go back and pull her into my arms. I would stroke her hair and tell her that one day the darkness wouldn't be a place of pain and fear. One day she would be wrapped in the shadows of someone who knew her deepest fears and her greatest pain, and she would welcome the darkness then. I would tell her that one day the darkness would feel like home. There is so much here in this small paragraph, the reparenting that's found in this moment, the tenderness involved, but especially the mention of darkness feeling like home. This sounds like it's written by someone who's familiar with this experience. So what do you feel comfortable in sharing about writing these words?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you picked that quote because that's one of my favorite quotes from Shadowcrown. And I think it was like a whole bunch of things coming together. Like that moment is such a character turning point for Kira. Like there's a lot of, self-action, I think, that comes out of that, like, bit of reflection for her. It also, I won't spoil anything for people who haven't read the book, but it really ties into a certain character that she's like learning to trust and bond with, which is very important for her, very important for the story. And then for me, I think like it also just was this like catalyst point where I got to work out some of my own feelings as someone who experiences constant depression. I spend most of the year battling with depression and in an active depressive episode than I do out of it, and just have since before I was a teenager. So I just liked that kind of sense of, you can have so much dread at times, like previous depressive episodes, or when you're a kid, especially when you're a kid who deals with that and you don't really understand it, you just feel like utter sadness and you don't have an explanation for it. It doesn't make sense to you. Being able to go back and maybe things aren't better, or it's like this utopia world that you found and everything's fixed, but you get the skills to manage through it, you get the support system to manage through it. And that's kind of what I was speaking to from my own experience. Of course, it's different with Kira. Her darkness isn't mostly depression. It's mostly guilt and grief for the situation that she's been put in, and also of finding out, this isn't too spoilerly, of that hope that she has in that book of maybe finding family kind of gets crushed, and she has to continue to move through that, and she can, and she knows she can because she's done it before. But just taking that time to feel the emotions for her is actually a really big deal in the second book. And I loved writing that. So whole mix of everything came together in that chapter.
Yeah, I can imagine that there's somewhat of a healing journey in being able to put those words onto a page.
Yeah, and weirdly, it's not for me at least, it's never moments that I think are going to. Like that chapter was plotted to go a very different way and kind of found itself, I think, through me kind of writing it through. But I never have active plans to kind of be like, oh, this correlates to something, this emotion inside me that I want to write it out. Like I never approach my writing like journaling, I guess. That's not, but you can't help what comes out when it comes out. And I really liked it. My editor really liked it. It worked really well. And yeah, I'm proud of that scene and that quote.
Yeah, good. That's really nice to hear. I feel like we don't always hear creatives saying, I feel really proud of this. So that's cool. It's nice to hear you say
Yeah, we
that's what it
don't. We're terrible at it. I don't know if I could say
is.
proud. That book was a struggle to write. There were just so many
Mm.
other factors that came into that book. So I'm slowly getting to the point where I can say, oh, I'm proud of these specific chapters, and maybe one day I'll be able to claim the whole book. But yeah, that book was just a struggle to get through. I think we wrote it three times completely from scratch in 5 months. It was while working full time. Yeah, I don't actually remember much of that time. It's just a blur of sitting at my desk.
Oh my gosh. Okay. I feel like I want to like talk more about that. Like, why do you think that writing the second book was such a struggle for you?
I think it was just a perfect storm of thankfully things that can and will not align again. For me, when I initially plotted out the Halfling Saga, the first book was self-published and then it got picked up by a traditional publisher. My original plan for how the books were going to release was A Broken Blade was going to come out, a prequel which talked of Kira's story before the events of Broken Blade and how she got trained to be an assassin was going to be the next release, followed by Shadow Crown and book 3 and book 4. So Shadow Crown, in my mind, is very much the middle of the narrative, but the version that I had drafted no longer worked if it wasn't coming after the prequel. There were huge plot points that needed to be changed just so it made sense to the reader reading it from A Broken Blade to A Shadow Crown. And it's very much the middle of the entire story, which is the hardest part of a book for me to write and get right, pacing wise. So it felt like I didn't have any fun points where I felt like I was really enjoying the pacing. The entire book felt like that. And then I was working full time, but also on a writer's schedule full time. Thankfully, I've been able to just support myself through writing now, so that's not going to be a problem again. But and then I managed to get hit with, I think, 2 of the worst depressive episodes that I had in a while. So dealing with all of that and then trying to rewrite the books multiple times because they just were not working was just so much stuff all at once. But thankfully, it'll never be my second book again. And I have learned the plotting skills that I don't think will run into the issues, just like the workplace issues of the working issues of writing a book and feeling the urge to rewrite it again and again when I could have just taken a step back and edit. But that's the newness of, being a new writer and being a new writer who's at least putting out books. So yeah, it was just the perfect the perfect storm. But thankfully people seem to really like A Shadow Crown. Some readers like it even more than the first one, and that's all I could hope for. So yeah.
I feel like there's 2 things that I want to pull from that. One, to talk about how like writing the middle of the story is the biggest struggle, at least you said for yourself as a writer. And I feel like I like the correlation because so just to give you a little bit more context in terms of like the Moonflower Path and the podcast and the community space, what we do here is we talk a lot about cyclical living, and that like middle part is usually the hardest part because the beginning, the anticipation and the motivation to like start this new thing is kind of dissipated. The end is nowhere near in sight. And so, yeah, typically the middle is the hardest part because you got to like stick with it, or there's just like things to work out. There's untangling to do. So I feel like it'll be somewhat validating for some of the listeners to hear that, because we have a lot of creative folk that listen to this podcast. So yeah.
Yeah, middles are hard, but when
Yeah.
you get them right, they feel so good.
Yes.
I will say nothing feels as good as nailing a middle act.
Okay, amazing. And then the other thing is not to like go in on you talking too much about those two big depressive episodes, but more so as like a, not let's not get too personal, but more as like people who do navigate mental illness, mental health issues, and also are creative or work for themselves or whatever, create their own schedule or not. How how do you manage in like a schedule, like tangible, practical way that happening? Because me personally, like, I don't want to just like ask you to share your soul. I will also talk about myself so that we're like having a conversation here. During the summer, I had to take an emergency week off of like everything within the business because I just like, I couldn't. Yeah, it was really hard to just get through the days. And I feel very grateful that I was able to take that week off. But it was a huge, scary thing to do, to be like openly honest and also just like halt everything, because we're not told that that's something that we can do. And so I'd be curious to hear tangibly how it is that you navigate that.
Yeah, I've learned I definitely don't have it quite all figured out yet.
I mean, who does?
You can't, yeah, and as much as I do have things that I know make my depression easier or make a depressive episode less likely to be triggered, they still come even when I'm really following all of that. But I think during a Shadow Crown, I did end up taking a leave from my full-time job, which, I could only do because I did have some money from writing. And thankfully my job was super, super accommodating to the last minute request they're like, yes, go finish your book. Don't be stressed, come back. Because that I think was one of the biggest hurdles for me was I wasn't sleeping. And that's a guarantee to set off my depressive episodes. How I manage that aspect, especially now, is I realized I made the mistake of agreeing to too short of timelines. I produced, like wrote, got it through edits, put it out into the world, a Broken Blade, very fast. I conceived of the idea, I think on May 1st of 2021. I had a full draft before June. It was into edits in July and it was published in November. So 6 months to like plot an idea, write it, publish it, and get it out, and then have a book deal by December, like, is unbelievably quick. But I was too green of an author to realize just how quick that was, and that wasn't a sustainable amount, or a pace that I could keep up. That was very much of just, having one of those creative sparks. We were locked in a pandemic. I had no distraction. My job at the time was very, very slow as we were trying to get onto a hybrid system. I just had all of this extra time. And then I agreed to very similar timelines for the following, for the rest of the series, thinking because I had partial drafts that it would be very easy to do. And then, work shifted, you go back into the office, you're not getting a little bit of writing done on your lunch break. It was much harder to hit my word goals. And I was very much staying up until 3 a.m, writing and editing, going to sleep, waking up at 6:30, going to work, and then trying to get through a full day of meetings just to start writing again at 4 until 3. So that became unsustainable. Now I'm able to mitigate that by having a much better idea of what I need in my schedule. And I plan for my depression. So my depression kind of has like 2 stages. One, I can't do anything at all. And sometimes it's because I'm in bed and I don't have the ability to get out. But for me, it's a lot of like terribly bad mind fog and dissociation. So I'll sit at my desk for hours and, nothing will get done and I won't really notice it. That's not really productive. That kind of stage lasts about 10 days possibly 2 weeks for me. Thankfully, it doesn't usually last that long. So I just plan for 2 of those in every book draft process, and I add an extra month into what I think I will need. And that has made the last book so much easier to get through. Deadlines have been on time. I feel much stronger about the books, and then it takes the stress away of, when I am feeling that way and I feel like I can't be productive, I'm no longer stressing about, I'm now 15,000 words on my word count. And that in turn has made the depression not come less frequently, but it is shorter. The other part of my depression is harder for me to work around. I get really like emotionally numb, and that makes certain things really hard to write. And it's not that it's difficult in that it's just that I can't emotionally connect to the work, and it ends up needing to be a rewrite anyway. So how I plan for that is when I'm feeling good, I tackle all of the hard, really emotional beats to get them out of the way, just in case that happens. And then on the days where I'm feeling like I just can't connect like that, or this is going to be a week of that, I will go and edit if I'm not done a draft. Like I usually edit my acts together just because that works better with how my brain works. Or I'll go and write like, one of those transitionary chapters where it's not a lot of emotion, but it's like, hey, we're moving the plot forward along and this discussion has to take place, and I'll write that. But yeah, that's mostly how I plan for it now. And then I really try to stick to a schedule of I don't let myself stay up all night. Last night, handing in the final manuscript, not included. I try to go to bed before midnight. I will take my full 8 hours of sleep. Make sure you have good routines and meal times, because I'm also someone who will sit at a computer for 8 hours, not realize I haven't eaten or taken a drink of water, sometimes not even gotten up to go to the bathroom, and then I just crash the next day because I haven't taken care of myself. So I have a lot of reminders on my phone that help very much, because if I'm caught in one of those artistic creative blasts, sometimes I pay for it the next day.
Wow. Okay. That was really awesome to hear all of that. I feel like, okay, one, thank you for your honesty and your vulnerability
No
in saying all
problem.
of that. That's really, I feel really honored. And also the level, as I'm hearing you talk, the level of self-awareness and the level of like, it sounds like you've really put a lot of time, I don't know if that's intentionally or not intentionally or just out of like survival, of really getting to know this part of yourself, which again, it brings it back to that quote that I pulled, is this idea of like accepting your darkness and getting to know it in a way that's non-judgmental, that is loving, that is pretty like neutral, so that then you can just be like, this is just a part of who I am.
Yeah.
Now let's recognize what different aspects this part of who I am needs, how she shows up, and just create my life and my self-care practices according to that, instead of getting all tangled in, I wish I wasn't this way, there's something wrong with me. Like moving past that, I think is huge.
Yeah. I mean, full disclosure, I have been to therapy. I've read a lot of therapy books. I didn't get there on my own. I know people talk about like their depression sometimes, especially in like books and literature. It's very common like for depression to be discussed as, or not discussed, but metaphorically on the page, as like a shadow self. Which, could very much, people could take that as what I'm trying to write in the book. I don't really conceptualize my depression that way. I kind of think of her as like a roommate, and she's not moving out. She's on the lease. And, I think we've all had that experience of you move with the first roommate and they annoy you and you don't talk about things and it just gets worse and worse and worse. Whereas if you just communicate and deal with it and structure things right from the get-go, it's a lot easier to manage. And, she's probably going to be my roommate for life. So I gotta learn to live with her.
Yeah. Yeah. My gosh. That's the title of this episode. Treating your mental health as your roommate.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Okay. Yeah. Super helpful and concrete things that you've shared. So really, really like that. Thank you. Hello, gentle listener. Carolyn here, interrupting today's episode to tell you about our new free resource called In Tune with the Moon. Learn to listen to, trust in, and honor your body intuition so you can feel empowered to take up space in your life with the moon by your side every step of the way. This free resource includes digital moon phase calendars. So that's pretty phone wallpapers and widgets that have a moon phase calendar on them from now until the end of the year, and they'll be updated in the new year. 4 lunar ritual videos that are about 30 minutes in length and always follow the same comforting ritual of some gentle yoga, some meditation, and some lunar inspired journal prompts. And yes, these are cozy and accessible. All bodies, all mobility levels are very much welcome. And a digital lunar journal to deepen your relationship with yourself and the moon. By downloading this resource, you'll also begin to receive our monthly Moonflower journal, filled with cozy and seasonal self-care resources. Had I mentioned that it's all for free? Get in tune with the moon as well as with yourself by clicking the link in the show notes or visiting our website, themoonflowerpath.com. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the creative process. Because as a creative myself, and the listeners will relate to this as well, there's this experience that creatives go through where we feel this urge to create something, right? Like, especially I can imagine that you felt it with the first book, where it's like this like drop of like, ooh, okay, there's this idea, and you like feel it drop in, and then there's the experience of voicing it, letting that story and that idea move through and out to be brought into the world. And I can imagine there are some really personal aspects and parallels between the stories you write and your own personal experience, which we've already touched on. But can you talk a little bit more about what it felt like to go through that process? And now kind of you're somewhat on the other side. You're still a little bit in the middle, but you've written the 4 books at this point. So what does it feel like to have, like, to go through that entire process from idea dropping in, now it's out into the world, and I'm sure that you've changed through that process as well. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I've definitely learned a lot. I was just listening to a TED Talk, actually. I can't remember her name. But she's the author of Eat, Pray, Love. And she was talking about how the creative process or a creative inspiration has been talked about like through the centuries. And that's where the word genius comes from. Like, it's this idea of, a genius speaking the ideas to you, and you're kind of just the tool that it lives through and gets created by. And I did have that moment for Broken Blade. Like, it was just one night I was sitting there, I was reading this book. I've been super recommended on TikTok, and it just had so much colonial themes. Like, I do think a lot of colonial themes are baked into the subgenre. And I was just like, oh, I wish I could find a series, like someone would really push a series in the subgenre that, was kind of breaking those themes or really confronting them, like is so much more common now not regular fantasy, but epic fantasy, standalone fantasy. We've just seen so much diversity in the stories coming there. And I was really craving it for the subgenre. And then it kind of all just fell. And I was like, well, you can write it, even though I've never wanted to write in this subgenre ever, had no interest in it. Suddenly I had the entire world, the entire plot done in like, I think 6 hours. And I wasn't planning to do it. I was just lying on my couch, reading a book and watching TikToks. So I definitely, like, that was very much the experience with the Broken Blade. And then it became this whole series. What I've learned through that, and which I think like kind of relates back to the second book, is that spark of, genius or creativity does not last, especially when you stretch it out over 4 books. And then you kind of feel really alone in the mess of it when you're like, why am I even writing this? I don't even want, that was one of the big struggles for me with the Shadow Crown, is I found myself like, oh wow, so many of my dreams are happening, but it's happening in a space that I never pictured it happening in. I very much like want to write epic standalone fantasy and science fiction. Like that had always been where I wanted to be. So kind of grappling with that, and how do you, spark the creativity yourself to write this story, to finish it out. And I think for me was just, really just sticking to a routine, sitting down and doing it, even when you feel bad and like not bad, like you don't want to sit down and write. Some of those days are the best writing days that I've had. And that's just a mental, like little reminder for me that just makes it a lot easier to write on the next day, that I feel like, oh, I'm just not getting it. I mean, having deadlines also helps. Like I was notorious for starting books and I would finish them or I would never edit them. I never wanted anyone to read them. I was so scared of having my friends read them. Like A Broken Blade was published before my family knew about it.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, like I don't even know if I had told that many friends. I think I just told one friend, like, oh, by the way, this is happening. And I don't know if she realized how serious I was. And having deadlines now, getting over that hurdle, that's made it easier to kind of be a creative in the moments where you don't feel like a creative. I have learned some practical things though. I don't know if I'll do another series quite this long again. If I do, I will not tell it all from the same character's point of view. I have found that really, really difficult to manage, and also sometimes really uninspiring to write just from Kira's perspective. I also do make sure I always have a project that kind of is that spark of full creativity where my mind just wants to think about. So in the midst of writing the Halfling Saga, I've also written 3 other books, I think, just kind of at the side of my desk. No deadlines, they're not under contract. They're just me fooling around, playing around. And that helps make it, the writing that is work writing, feel a lot more fun. But that took a whole year of severe trial and error, and the worst experiment I've ever done on myself to kind of figure it out. And thankfully with the 4th book, I finally kind of found that ratio of, I write about 25% of my words a week are for a project that I'm just super excited about, and 75% of the words I write are for something under contract.
Okay. Yeah, I like that aspect of having some creative practices that are just for you, that are just for play. And not only does that offer a reprieve, but it also actually fuels the other work creativity.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that so many creatives end up having to grapple with, right? Is when our art meets capitalism. And like those stories, even though I didn't write them, for a proposal, I didn't write them because they were on deadline or under contract. I might publish them, but at least in their conception, they were just this fun space of creativity. And one of them I'm really excited about, and actually turned out really well. The other 2, they're not that great. They're just a whole bunch of random scenes kind of slopped together, but they were really, really fun to write. And it definitely got me through some of the darker moments with Kira, because I love Kira, but my goodness, I don't know if I'll pick that traumatized of a character to write solely from their perspective again. Because sometimes I wondered if my depression was making Kira so sad, or if writing Kira constantly had made me more likely to be depressed. So yeah, but her story has come to a close now. It's for me drafting, so
Yeah.
that'll be good.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. That's really interesting. Was there ever, I mean, I can't imagine that there wasn't. Was there ever a moment at the beginning, because you had never written before, where you were like, I can't do this. Who am I to think that I can do this?
There definitely were. Like, there was one part where, looking back and knowing what I know about the book industry, and certainly what it takes to self-publish a book, because I am going to be self-publishing still. I'm going to do like a hybrid approach to writing. I would never do what I did. I would never, I will never counsel someone to be like, yeah, write a book, go get it done, and then you just put it out into the world and it's fine and it will work out and you'll make all your money back. That is by not the norm. I had one very good marketing idea that worked extremely well in my favor, and that's because I knew Book Talk so well. I had been posting on it. I kind of figured I would know what worked. I made the entire release a surprise. I released the book anonymously. People had to kind of figure out it was me. And then thankfully people also really enjoyed the book. So it kept that momentum going, and it just grew to beyond anything I had imagined. But no, there were very few moments where I felt like, oh no, this isn't doable. But I think that's just was blissful ignorance of all of the things I didn't know and all the problems I didn't realize could happen. I had like one timeline issue where things didn't line up, and I got a version back of my book and it wasn't sized correctly, and there wasn't enough time to fix it on the program and get another test book sent to me. So I just risked it all and ordered all of the books I needed to order with that fix, hoping that they would work out, and thankfully they did. Nothing was crooked. But I didn't know that that was a common thing, and that's why people take 3 months of like pre-production to make sure everything looks great and they can get their books from all of their printers. I had no idea. None. I just learned about that's a typical standard timeline, I think 6 months ago. So yeah, some of it was just blissful ignorance in the beginning. All of that ignorance, though, comes crashing down with the second book. Now I'm very aware. And I think that was a huge part of that storm that I was talking about of, suddenly I was learning so much more, but also realized I'm not prepared for any of this. I want to go back to the version of me that was just writing the first book and didn't have to think about, retention rates of a series. Like a lot of people are like, oh, it's a really great that you got your first book contract, and that's super important, but you don't even really get to enjoy that very much, because now it's like, okay, well, we got to make sure the second release numbers are as good as we can make them. When you're writing your first book, you're super excited to get the contract, but when it's a series, you don't even get to enjoy it. You kind of have to jump right into the second book, getting it done. You're doing the marketing for the first release, and then by the time the second book comes out, it's a very different game, because now you have numbers to judge yourself against, right? And they're looking at, okay, how many readers are we going to move from book 1 to book 2? It's a lot of discussion about, for me, was my publisher even going to pick up my fourth book? This was all of that time where it's being determined. And that type of business sense and business outlook suddenly being applied to my books that had been just this like fun thing that I decided to get published, and then it worked out really well, was like a wake up moment for me. And it was really hard to like settle with that perspective and understand that it's an important perspective, but it didn't have to impact my writing. But yeah, I know that was a long tangent, but I hope someone gleaned something of interest from that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it also, again, it brings it back to like the beginning is fun, the middle is hard, but
yeah,
there's something to be learned and something to be gained from making it through that middle part. Because oh my gosh, I can totally relate to that just with a business, with having been running the Moonflower Path. It used to be called Yoga with Carolyn, and at the beginning, it literally just like blossomed so easily and so quickly. It all started with outdoor yoga classes because it was the pandemic and that's what people wanted. And I was just like, okay, I'll give this a shot. And it went really well. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to make this a business. And it's been hard to stay committed to that because you have to start thinking about analytics. Like, never even used that word before ever in my life. And like,
yeah. And then everything that you were doing for fun, or that you were just in, everything that was an outlet, right, becomes something that you have to do. And that, for me, I don't know, I'm a bit of a stubborn personality. That's hard for my brain to wraparound, like now I make money discernibly from posting TikToks that talk about my book, and I don't think I've posted in 6 weeks because I don't like feeling like I have to. Like that is still something I definitely have to grapple with, of the where still finding the fun, even though now it's become a job, because being a creative for a job is much more worth it and is extremely privileged opportunity to have compared to what I was doing before, which was being a creative between the hours of 6 and 9 and then going to work in a job that I wasn't fully satisfied with.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Okay. I like that. Finding the fun where you can.
Yeah.
Because
and it's a lot of it then.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and creatives, we like play and creativity go so hand in hand. So yeah, we thrive in that play and that fun. So I like that. I like that perspective. Okay. Earlier on, when you were answering the question, you talked about how you were really hoping to infuse aspects of colonialism into this subgenre. So tying into that, you were very vocal about your identity as a queer person and an Indigenous person living on Turtle Island. And I can imagine that there's a real pride in that since you're so vocal about it. And I'd love to know more about the journey towards really not only claiming those identities and stepping into that, but also kind of going a step forward and really incorporating that into the work that you do. So I'd love to just hear about a little bit of that.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say I'm proud to be and live life as both those things. I think some of it too is just I found it a lot easier to navigate the world and navigate um people's perceptions and assumptions of me when I was very upfront and vocal about those things. As someone who, my mom is Anishinaabe, my dad is white, a lot of people don't perceive me as Indigenous right off the bat. A lot of people um, don't perceive me as queer immediately. And sometimes that gets you put in the position where they have assumptions that you see the world like them. So for me, it was just a lot easier, and I had a much better time engaging with people if they just knew that, and I was very much like upfront about it. As to why I make sure that people understand it in my books, and that it's not just a huge part of my books, but like it's how I talk about my books, present myself as an author, is because there's no way to disentangle myself from my Indigenous identity and my queer identity, and how that impacts how I see the world from the stories that I'm choosing to write and the way that I'm choosing to write them. Like the entire conception of A Broken Blade was very much that. I was reading all these books that were super fun and had the badass assassin, or the badass, like maybe she's not assassin, she's a lost princess who's really good with a sword for some reason, trying to reclaim her kingdom. But then there's these like side mentions of the people who lived there before, but they're not on the page, and maybe they're just dead because that's easier. And then I was like, okay, but what if they're not? What if that is the main conflict of the book, instead of just this very simplistic kind of structure of two people vying for a throne that is probably neither theirs to begin with. And that's just been very helpful, and it helps me I guess it filters out people who might read my books otherwise and wouldn't like them, or watch my videos otherwise and wouldn't like my takes. It just filters out a lot of people who are not going to want to engage with it positively. And then I just remember what it was like as a kid, not seeing any representation, both on the queer side and on the Indigenous side. Like there were no gay characters in books for teenage, like even 10 years ago. Like there has been a huge jump now, and I think it's so easy to forget, but like no one gay was in books. There were no Native characters in books. The only series I can think of is Twilight, and that's just terrible representation. Absolutely ridiculous representation. But and I just kind of always that's always been my stance as a writer, is I want to tell as many stories as I can with all the representation that I would have loved to have as someone who read very early. And, you know, and I'm going to tell them in as many different ways and as many different genres as I can. And, you know, people who like it will get it, and people who don't can just not read them. And that's perfectly okay with me.
Well, as a fellow queer, it's like literally the reason I picked up the book. So yeah, really.
That's what I love. I love when it gets marketed that way, because this flood of people find me and they're like, oh, there's something, even though it's not, you know, even though like full transparency, Kira is in a relationship with a male throughout the book, but the entire society of the Elven and the Indigenous society is very queer positive and very much based off of what Turtle Island would have looked like before contact. And I just love writing casual queerness into stories. Bisexual representation into stories too, because I feel like we could still have more representation on that side of the rainbow, or that part of the rainbow.
Yeah, I like that casual queerness, because as queer folk, like, this is just our life and it's just normal. And I definitely get tired of the classic storyline where it's like two queer people, one of them is like still in the closet, they're doing it on the side and it's secretive, or there's been like so much struggle. And not that is not something I want to hear about, but it's not the only version of the story. That's not the only version of queerness that exists. So yeah, I like that.
I think that's just the most approachable and entertaining to non-queer people, which caused, especially, I can only speak to the book space, but especially in the book space, of those were the only types of queer stories for so long that were even going to get through the door. But I love this kind of, you know, last 8 years and now, where queer people can just write their stories and the queer characters can be messy. Like, Kira is not an easy pill to swallow. But there's some brighter, more fun queer characters that you'll meet. But Kira is not one of them.
Yeah, definitely. Oh man. Okay, we've come to the end of our conversation. So I have one last question. What's something you'd like to say to someone listening who might find themselves in a dark place right now, but has some whispers of longings and dreams inside of them? What would you like to say to that person?
I would say, get sleep, eat some really good food, and then when you have time, just sit down and be struck by that inspiration of whatever dream you have. And then do that again. I think in the beginning, especially if you're dealing with depression or anything, don't let your darkest moments taint your dreams. I think you'll just create a nightmare for yourself. Try to set yourself up for success, you know? Make sure you're well rested. Make sure you're fed. Go outside if you haven't in the past 4 days. Get some fresh air and then come to it. And I think that will just help. Much more than it sounds like it will help. It will help.
Beautifully put. Thank you. Oh my goodness. Well, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I feel, this was really awesome. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to put all the links to the books, to all of the things in the show notes for people to get their hands on the books, because there are 2 more coming, which is very exciting.
Yes, super excited.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of the Moonflower Path podcast. I'm your host, Carolyn, and ways that you can find more support from me and this cozy community are all found in the show notes. Please consider rating, reviewing, and sharing this podcast with a friend. Those are the best ways to show your support for this free and accessible resource. Wishing you a gentle rest of your day, and I look forward to connecting again with you very soon.